So let's jump right into the first incident. So it's about 4 a.m. A healthcare facility is now having and seeing IT operational issues, right? Patient portals are going down. Healthcare equipment that's stationed and housed on legacy operating systems are failing. And the on-call IT team has now been summoned to do an investigation. They start their investigation with the database servers that house the electronic healthcare records, and soon find that it's been encrypted and then find ransom notes tied and pointing directly to Vice Society ransomware. Within 24 hours, ambulances are now being diverted. Patients on site are now being redirected to their nearby facility. And within 48 hours, they've brought on a third-party IR team to kind of go through, do their incident response, and contain the situation. Part of their containment strategy is to disable internet access at the perimeter, disabling both incoming and outbound communications and disabling remote access. Also, they had the IT team go ahead, do a password reset, right? Resetting full global password reset, including the Active Directory, Kerberos account, the KRB TGT account, doing 2 rounds of that just to invalidate any golden tickets that the adversary may have had access to due to the incident. They also pushed out their own endpoint detection and response tool, their AV solution for all the endpoints and all the servers, and removed the EDR tool that was being leveraged by the facility. At this time, property management is aware of the situation. For situational awareness, the healthcare facility did not own this smart building location, right? They leased it. So at this point, property management being responsible for the OT systems, the building control systems, are now concerned. Right? So part of our objective is now to come on site, oversee the engagement, partner with the first IR team, and determine if there's an active adversary, determine if the OT systems are now compromised. We were also tasked to provide guidance on threat actor negotiations. There was interest on both the property management as well as the healthcare facility side to negotiate with the threat actor, pending IR, pending the forensics. Also, we wanted to determine if there was data exfiltrated and determine root cause. Anytime you have 2 IR firms working a single incident, things always go wrong, right? Teams don't want to share evidence. They don't want to communicate, right? There's too many cooks in the kitchen. In our case, since we had different priorities, we did work well together. However, there were pain points, one being the OT systems, right? Property management outsourced the vendor OT systems to a variety of vendors. So we had to reach out, make contact, request access to asset inventories, request access to network topologies. We also wanted to roll out our triage scripts to do a due diligence review over these OT systems to make sure they weren't compromised. However, they pushed back hard, right? They didn't want us running our scripts. They didn't want systems going offline. They didn't want us voiding manufacturer warranties. And they did not have a good sense of the environment. They couldn't produce asset inventories. They couldn't tell us what's on the network. They didn't have cybersecurity tooling. So we were pretty much blind from the onset. So from there, we decided to direct our attention to the firewall logs. Both IT and OT systems shared an internet connection. They both were benefiting off a single firewall that the healthcare facility managed. Now, the firewall wasn't logging data, but they were pushing it to a SIM that provided a year's worth set of logs. Once we got access, we had issues, right? We couldn't download the logs. So we had to work with the vendor of the SIM to figure out what the issue was. Come to find out, that SIM provider was undergoing a ransomware incident of their own. And at that point, we couldn't pull the logs, right? We found out because the threat actor, different variant, publicized the incident on the dark web. We saw it, we called them out on it, but they denied, right? They claimed they had backups. They claimed the backups were able to be restored and we should have access to our logs. Needless to say, we didn't, right? Those logs, we had to move on, right? They weren't available, and we directed our attention now back to threat actor communications. Part of our strategy here, and the first IR team, having vetted those backups, realized they had been wiped, right? Threat actor owned the domain, right? Backups were on-prem, there was no off-site copy, and they did not leverage another authentication mechanism not tied to Active Directory. So So basically, the threat actor just wiped the backups. So from that perspective, the healthcare facility needed to get back operational, and they needed the decryptor to do so. So with that being said, we had a strategy call to discuss next steps. That included copying all the encrypted data to another staging VLAN isolated from the compromised network, so when we purchased the decryptor, we could decrypt the encrypted files on the copy and not the original set in case something went wrong. Also, we wanted to pull some encrypted files and forward it to the threat actor to prove their decryptor worked before we make any type of purchase. And then finally, we needed that ransom note to initiate comms. Going through that process, that's when the first IR team kind of dropped a bombshell, letting us know that encrypted files and the ransom notes were all gone. When they pushed out their EDR tool at the beginning of the incident, it flagged it as malware and deleted all the ransom notes, all the encrypted files. Huge mistake. Because now we can't get back operationally. They don't have backups. We need a decryptor. So we had to waste 2 weeks to recover those files. The first week, they used a tool that, while it recovered all the data, it provided no context. It changed the original file name, and it did not show or provide the source location of the files or where they resided from. Not helpful. We had a bunch of encrypted data that we had no context. So they had to use another tool, redo the same process. While this time it was successful, we still burned 2 weeks, and obviously we're now stalling with the threat actor, and they've become agitated, and they've raised the demand to the ransom. They also are now only giving us 3 days to make a purchase. With all that being said, it wasn't all doom and gloom. We did have great success with NetFlow logs. At this point, from an OT perspective, we had no visibility. We didn't have the documentation, the vendors weren't helpful, but we had NetFlow logs, which provided a full baseline set of communication and let us see historically how these systems were communicating, and we didn't see any signs of compromise. There was no lateral movement, no malicious communications coming from the compromised network to these OT systems. It was mainly business as usual, right? So we kind of cleared those systems. However, we did find 4 terabytes of data being exfiltrated on the IT side of the house with the healthcare facility, all going to an IP address destined in the Netherlands over port TCP 445, SMB. So instantly thought maybe they just mapped a share over SMB to this malicious server, public facing, and exfiltrated the data. And the forensics did show that, right? We found the endpoint where the data was originated from. We ran forensics and confirmed they in fact mapped a share, right? This server was a Windows operating legacy server, did not have EDR, no AV, because it wasn't compatible. So we were pretty much blind to this asset. Also, threat actor negotiations and decryption actually went well. Anytime you purchase a decryptor and run a decryptor, 75% of the time you have success. Most often, not everything is decrypted, especially virtual machines, the larger set, they usually don't fully decrypt. In this scenario, we ran 2 rounds of the decryptor. It worked perfectly. We were able to get them back operationally within 7 weeks, combined with the fact that we used a 3-stage VLAN approach where we left the compromised network on fire, moved all systems that were compromised, where we re-imaged, added EDR tools and security on a staging VLAN, and then moved them slowly to a clean network. Doing that paired with visibility from our EDR tool, visibility at the network level, we were able to kind of play whack-a-mole, find systems, clean them, and then get them back operationally after that 7-week period. So let's talk about the incident attack lifecycle through the lens of the MITRE ATT&CK Framework. Root cause. Root cause pointed to an OT server, HVAC server, that we found through the NetFlow logs, right? We walked the evidence back. The first sign of malicious activity was tied to this HVAC server because it was port scanning the environment. We went back to this vendor, talked to them, asked them questions, and of course we wanted one triage on this server specifically now that we had evidence of compromise on the OT side of the house. Come to find out, then they admitted that they had been compromised. One of their engineers fell to a phishing email attack, and the threat actor got access to their email account and got access to a spreadsheet full of credentials tied to TeamViewer, a remote access tool, in which the threat actor was able to access the HVAC server. Once they got access, they started going through their discovery mechanisms, using AD Recon, NL tests to kind of map out the domain. when they were trying to execute malware and binaries and ransomware. They were using WMI, PSExec tools, legitimate system administration tools, and staging them on servers and then executing them remotely. What's also interesting is they were creating malicious accounts. One account of note that I have listed here, account name was Windows Win 10 Recovery, and the password they chose for this account was to infinity and beyond. Right, Toy Story, right? And a lot of the accounts they were creating were choosing these cartoon movie references. Why is this important? Because now we know the attacker's age, period. From there, they moved laterally using RDP, Cobalt Strike. They dumped credentials dumping registry, and then obviously using NTDS utility on the domain controllers. They also wiped event logs, modified registry as a form of defense evasion, exfiltrated data, and finally detonated ransomware. What's also interesting to note about this is they had an EDR tool without the profile within the environment, and we had logs and access to those logs, and when we reviewed them, a lot of these alerts were firing, right? The EDR tool was just set to monitor, not to block. They just had no one watching it, so they fell victim to the same issues we always see where companies and properties feel like their EDR tool is really set it and forget it. In this case, it was not. So let's talk about incident number 2 with Lockbit 3.0. With this incident, another smart building property location that houses both commercial and residential tenant spaces, the attack targeted a physical access server. It's the brain to the badging system. Tenants badge in to get access to the property. They were compromised for about a week before they realized they were compromised. Reason being is the badging sensors worked in absence of the server. So the only time they figured it out is when the property management tried to provision a new badge or revoke access, the server was offline and obviously no changes could occur. In which case, prompted them to bring in the vendor to manage the physical access server to do an investigation. Obviously, they found ransomware. They found it was due to Lockbit. They did notify the property management team, but they also confiscated the server, left, and did not provide any follow-up. At this point, property management team is now concerned. It's been 4 days, no response from the vendor. They've escalated to leadership. They've escalated to our team at JLL. And part of our responsibility is similar to the first incident is make contact with the vendor, run a forensic investigation on the OT physical access server. We wanted to determine if there was an active adversary in the environment as well as if it spread to other areas of the network. Also, this was Lockbit 3.0, who's known to exfiltrate data and also known to publicize the incident on their blog posting. So they wanted us to keep tabs on their Onion site just to make sure there was no references to this incident and obviously escalate if necessary. We also were tasked to determine exfiltration and determine the root cause that caused the incident. So naturally, we reached out to the vendor as well as the other OT vendors to kind of do a due diligence review to kind of look at the environment as whole. Same situation. There was a single firewall. The parking garage also had an internal firewall, but nothing was being logged. We couldn't run tooling. We did reach out and get access to the physical access server vendor, and they did mention that the physical access server originally was sitting behind the firewall. They removed it behind the firewall because they had to do an upgrade, and they didn't put it back. They just plugged it directly into the modem, right? And our forensics basically confirmed that. Once we did run forensics on this physical server, we saw brute force activity tied to the remote desktop protocol, RDP. As soon as the threat actor was on the box, they reviewed, profiled the system. They disabled Windows security, Windows Defender, Device Guard. They also downloaded ransomware through PowerShell. They deleted the Windows backups, the volume shadow copies, and then they detonated ransomware. They literally were on this box for no more than maybe an hour and a half. They didn't try to recon the environment. They didn't try to move laterally. They didn't even try to exfiltrate data. This was basically the property dodged a huge bullet with this incident. It could have been much worse. Like this incident, and like the first incident, this incident was due to the mismanagement of our OT systems by the vendor. In this case, poor change control policies were utilized where they took the physical access server, they upgraded it but didn't put it back behind the firewall, they didn't document anything, they didn't make contact to the vendor who managed the firewall, they failed to disable accounts. The account that was compromised was tied to the original vendor who managed that physical access server. When they were onboarded, they were contracted to remove that service account. They did not. That service account, like their account, failed to follow password best policies. It was set to never expire, never been reset. Also, the current vendor did also fail to secure the backups. Backups were plugged directly into the server, and they were encrypted, right? So they had to rebuild. And finally, they chose an insecure method to do remote administration with RDP. We did talk to them about that, and they claimed that was a mistake. That's not normally how they do business, so we fact-checked. We had our threat intelligence team scour the internet for all active sessions tied to RDP and this vendor, and what you see on screen is the output of that search. Multiple RDP sessions tied to this vendor. The threat actor actually missed a huge opportunity because I guarantee each of those active RDP sessions are using the same password. So in terms of smart building challenges, what we've seen from these incidents and incidents we have worked, there are a lot of challenges that allow threat actors to readily identify vulnerabilities, gain an internal foothold in the environment, move laterally, exfiltrate data in some cases, and then detonate ransomware. All of which really point to the public-facing or the internet-facing attack surface of our property buildings, of our smart buildings. The bulk of the activity is really pointing to these admin web portals, right? Most often, we're seeing admin portals tied to the firewall, tied to ISP modems, tied to access points, and we're also seeing them from building control systems themselves, building automation system, HVAC, parking, air control, IoT devices, right? And all of which are housing vulnerabilities. They're unpatched. Some cases, they're using default credentials. Some cases, they're not using multi-factor authentication, and they're using poor password policies, right? They're also using, also public-facing, we see a lot of instances of legacy and insecure protocols, RDP being one, Telnet, FTP, LLTP, right? We're also seeing building control system protocols, Fox protocol and BACnet, right? Additionally, when we talk about our smart buildings, most often the bulk of our smart buildings are really just refurbished from exterior perspective. Most of the smart buildings, they've added building automation systems, they've added IoT devices to help with the energy efficiency, air control, power, et cetera, that give them that smart title. But they're sitting on legacy network equipment, right? Non-managed switches, non-commercial grade firewalls, non-commercial grade routers, right? All of which are not providing cybersecurity, all of which are allowing these networks to be flat, not segmented, and we're outsourcing all of our work to various vendors who are not using cybersecurity best practices. And from a property management perspective, we can't really hold our property managers and our local engineers, our OT engineers accountable because they're not IT or cybersecurity professionals, right? While we push out OT security standards, while we give guidance on what to put in these contracts from a cybersecurity perspective, we still need to help our property managers more in this regard. In doing so, that kind of takes us to lessons learned. So in terms of our lessons learned, we needed to find a single solution that addressed a lot of these vulnerabilities that we're seeing, right? All one solution. With this solution, with SD-WAN, there are solutions that provide their own hardware. We'll call these a virtual gateway. The hardware itself houses a configuration to a secure connection that communicates to a centralized hub in the cloud, which is basically a data center. This allows all inbound and outbound communication to be funneled through this cloud or centralized hub. It's an encrypted channel. Once the communication reaches the centralized hub, before ultimately reaching its ultimate destination, we can apply threat intelligence. Now we're flagging against malware, flagging against suspect IP addresses, and we can set it and configure it in monitor-only mode, or we can have it block. We can also configure network access policies, something more than what a firewall would provide. And we're also, once it reaches the cloud, we have full visibility because we're now logging and we're now monitoring that activity. We can also build asset inventories. We can also build network topologies with this, things we couldn't receive from the vendors. With this configuration, also, we are shielding the property's attack surface. No longer are we allowing insecure remote access. No longer do we have critical services being publicly exposed. Everything sits behind that cloud infrastructure. If the vendors need remote access, if our property managers need remote access, if our local OT engineers need remote access, they have to do so using this service's native VPN client, which has built-in multi-factor authentication and a policy, a password policy we have set and defined. Furthermore, this solution also is compatible with legacy network equipment, right? It also provides segmentation. We can deploy multiple instances of these virtual gateways, deploy them internally, and have them shield the various OT subnets that are in our environment. And we can also define more policy to limit communication internally. Any communication that passes through that virtual gateway before it reaches that cloud infrastructure is encrypted. So now we're protecting those legacy protocols. We're getting segmentation. We're not allowing insecure remote access, and effectively addressing a lot of the vulnerabilities we're seeing from an incident response perspective at our smart buildings. Questions?
Hopefully not a gotcha question, but I respect the fact that you just led with, hey, we had to do threat actor negotiations, get the decryptor. Was that something unusual or usual in your responses to have to quarterback and coordinate that, or was that left up to the building owners as to decision as to whether to pay or rebuild, et cetera?
Yeah, very good question. Ultimately, it's really property management and really the ownership of the building, right? In that situation specifically, and from my stance is we don't negotiate with threat actors, right? However, it's still a business decision. Every time we do incident response, companies, whether it's a smart building, whether it's an enterprise, they come in refusing to pay. But things change during incident response. When you figure out backups are gone and you need to get back operationally, you change your mind and we have to pivot. In this instance, based on the fact they had no backups, the hospital was under pressure from their board to get back operationally. The only viable way to get back was to purchase a decryptor. And again, we provide, it's still give and take. It's like a marathon. It's not a sprint. We have to explain the consequences. You are negotiating or you are communicating with a threat actor, right? In most cases, threat actors do keep their word because they want to keep that reputation alive, where if you pay, we'll deliver the goods, and they want that reputation to be public, right? We do have threat actors that do provide decryptors that do not work and cause problems, but most often than not, 75% of the time, they do work. But again, it's a business decision. We outweigh the consequences. We talk to property ownership. We talk to legal. But ultimately, it's their decision. All we do is provide them the information to make that educated decision, and we help guide that process. But ultimately, it's an ownership. It's a business decision.
On that same topic, did you have that worked out ahead of time, meaning who in the business was going to make that call, or were you doing that on the fly? And the same with the incident response teams. Did you have them lined up ahead of time, or were you doing it on the fly?
Honestly, it's done on the fly. Incident response is really reactive in nature. We build our response process. We have our small teams. We have all that stuff prepared. So, because anytime during incident response, things change. You need to pivot accordingly, right? So a lot of our process, even from a threat actor negotiation, there's even more that goes into that, right? There's a sanctions review that you need to complete, and that's you work with legal into doing that. Because right now, you don't want to fund a sanctioned entity by the U.S., right? Because then you can face legal consequences on the back end. So based on, pulling forensics, doing those things, submitting to legal, having them clear you from a sanctions perspective, like all that stuff, there's separate steps, right? It's not an easy one-click thing. We have to make sure all our ducks in a row, make sure those processes are done. But from our group, everything is planned. Like everything how we proceed, our procedures are really consistent. The only thing is dynamic is the incident, right? We just have to be nimble and pivot accordingly.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you. I appreciate it. Enjoy the conference.